this is Mansa. This is just a little disclaimer to let our listeners know that the episode you're about to listen to was recorded on the 28th of March. So, some references to events may be a little out of date. The reason for the delay was partly technical difficulties, but also scheduling. I apologize, but I hope you enjoy. And I just want to say that although Cuba has now all but disappeared from the Western news for the time being, the situation there hasn't improved. So, if you can, please donate. The link is in the description. Every little bit counts. Hello and welcome to another episode of Spot Talk. Today we're going to talk about Cuba. As we mentioned in a recent episode, comrades with the Partisan Defense Committee were on the ground with the Nuestra America Flotilla, delivering aid to the country, which is experiencing tremendous difficulty as the US tightens its squeeze. The PDC raised nearly £19,000, and you can still donate to the effort. So our comrades recently returned, and I've invited them today on the show to tell us about what their experience was like, what is the reality on the ground, what it was like actually being there with hundreds of other activists internationally, as well as their general impressions of where things stand and what the future of the Cuban Revolution is. So to that end, I'm joined by Anna, Lisa, and Tom. Welcome,
nice
comrades.
To be here.
Thank you.
Hello, Mansa. Nice to be here.
Thank you for making the time. Right, so we're recording this from 3 different countries. Can I just ask that you guys quickly introduce yourselves, where you're speaking from, and just give us a little bit of a sense of, who you are?
I'm Lisa, and I am currently living in Mexico City, and it was very interesting to go to Cuba from here.
I'm Tom. I'm from New York City. One more transit worker. And it was quite an opportunity, but quite daunting to be down there. And I'm looking forward to telling you some of our experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm Anna. I'm from Athens, Greece. It was really a great experience to be there. I'm looking also forward to say to the people, our supporters, our followers, how it has been. It was quite unique. And again, thank you for having us.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, it's a big topic. Cuba is one of those things where you can't necessarily trust what you hear in the news, almost 99% of the time. So I guess let's just start broadly. I assume this was the first time for you guys being in Cuba?
I was lucky. I was lucky to have been there in 1993, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, when it was in the special period. And that was also a horrible, horrible time. Interestingly enough, at that time, people were really having a hard time getting the basic and enough protein to eat on a weekly basis. It was a really tough time. But in some ways, now it's even worse.
Mm-hmm. And Lisa, had you been before?
No, but I did want to say that I have really been wanting to go to Cuba at least for 40 years, since I was a brigadista in Nicaragua in 1985 during the Contra War. And, some of the friends that I made there were Sandinista guerrillas who had been injured in the overthrow of Somoza and had gone to Cuba for medical aid.
That's really cool. I had no idea that you had that background. That's cool. Okay, so let's just go alphabetically to keep it simple. I'm going to ask like a general question. What is like the most standout thing from your trip? You were there, by the way, for what, a week?
No,
4 days.
4 days.
4 days.
4 days.
4 days.
Yeah.
Busy itinerary, I know. But I guess let me just start with first impressions. What was your first impression of the country, Anna?
Well, really the first impression of the country is the situation is really dire. Poverty is really a huge thing. The thing is that there is no medication, basically, in the hospitals. We made also some photos. If you see the pharmacies, are completely empty, like they're closed shops. There is food, but the problem is that the people don't have money for food. The government stores are empty. And they have, what you call in English is ration book. How you call it? Ration book,
Ration book?
Ration book, yes. Which actually they used to, can take 5, 6 things maybe in the past. Now, basically, they can buy literally nothing. So there is these small private shops, which are much more expensive, and you need dollars or euros, even pesos, but the people don't have actually the money to buy them. So the situation for the majority is at the stand of the population, and what actually the Cubans told us is really very, very serious. Like the blockade, no oil. That means many factories are closed. The transportation is very limited. And also, they told us, for example, that sometimes, the factories maybe can work from few hours during the night when the people don't use electricity maybe for 4 hours. So basically, the economy is really collapsing. There is not like the situation is really bad, and the gains of the revolution, like free education and especially healthcare, is really under threat. That's and I can say more like explicit, like more particular things in the way.
Yeah. Lisa, what stayed with you?
Well, I think I just wanted to say something about healthcare too, because the Cuban people are very proud of the gains of the revolution in terms of healthcare. Even after COVID, when things were horrible, they came up with 2 vaccines that were very good and very quickly. They have a vaccine that is for 18 different diseases, things that nowhere in the imperialist world even do they have. But at the moment, it's very dire. We did bring medical supplies to the hospital, and the director came out, and they were very thankful, but it was kind of a drop in the bucket in a lot of ways. So we ran into a couple people on the street. One man had lost a leg, and he was going to lose the second one if he didn't get care. But he told us that he needed to buy the medical supplies with US dollars on the black market before he could go to the hospital and get care. Likewise, a woman had a very inflamed neck. She didn't know if it was thyroid or if it was cancer, but she was unable to even get a biopsy to see if it was cancer until she could get enough US dollars. So, they have this healthcare system, but people are not able to get treatment. And I'm not sure, I know they did say things like the Chinese electric vehicles are used for hospital personnel, so they have the people, but they don't have the medicine, and also the equipment won't always be working because of the blackouts.
And Tom, let's go to you.
These are scenes of desperate poverty that you can see, all over the world. But it's striking in Cuba, where there had been, some economic basis for social equality and for people to get food and housing and healthcare. But by way of contrast, there were also tall, 15 to 30-story buildings that have been built up by foreign investors. These are for the tourist sector. So you can see beautiful buildings, and that we were told were essentially empty because the endeavor to develop the tourist sector completely collapsed with COVID, and now, of course, with the horrific blockade. Another contrast was, as the other comers are saying, with healthcare. The hospital where we went to donate our medicine and stuff was actually incredibly orderly, clean, well maintained, filled with staff who are ready to help at a moment's notice. Even in much better than a lot of hospitals you see in the United States and anywhere else, where you walk into an emergency room that's just a beehive of craziness. We didn't see that. But it's also another final thing I would say is that when you do walk around Havana, you're approached, almost every several minutes by people desperate to get a little bit of money, a little bit of hard currency, which could mean the difference of life or death for them or their loved one, to get medicine or critical supplies.
Yeah. I would like to stress a couple of the points. Really, also the contradictions. I mean, this guy who would lose probably both legs, at the same time, he spoke 7 languages. And we say, like, he was absolutely poor. Say, how on earth you speak 7 languages? Well, Cuba has the best educational system in the world. And also I want to, this thing about the black market and healthcare is a big thing, man. Because, what Lisa said, even if you go to the doctor, for something at the hospital, they will tell you, okay, but I need this medicine, and this medicine. So yes, you need to go to the black market, but how you find the money to go to the black market and buy that? So people, they have infections or other stuff that can easily be treated. And one other thing is that, and I think it's very important for whoever listen and also to spread the word, I think, is that although, is a drop in an ocean what we gave, actually the director of the hospital said it really helps. It really helps to actually, little by little to gather, aid for medication. So it's important, and we call whoever wants to do that, it's really necessary. It's a kind of a lifeline to try to preserve as much as possible. Yeah.
I should have said you guys were just in Havana, so we don't even really have a sense of the rest of the country, which I imagine is probably struggling more than Havana. Would you say is that from what you've read or heard? Is that correct?
We spoke with a lot of local people, like they're extremely friendly. It's really nice to talk to them. And you can see it's a deformed work estate, how people are talking,
what does that mean?
It means that, it's like,
I think for the young people out there, how do you tell the way people talk that it's
it's like, I don't know how to express it, but it's like, everybody's political. You talk just easily to everybody. Everybody will tell you what they think. It's like, when you're talking leftist a little bit, although the leftists are talking less, I have to say, Ingrid. But it's really nice. It's really nice. The people really want to talk to you. They're very open and very friendly. Sorry, what's the question? I forgot. What was the question? The difference.
Havana versus the rest of the.
Well, from what they told us, we haven't been there. Well, I think there are many contradictions. For example, they told us that electricity blackouts are worse in the countryside. So, for example, in Havana, people have gas like propane, and they can cook. But in the countryside, they don't. So many, they cook on wood, for example. The other thing is that, though, the difference is that, for example, in Havana, we talk to teachers, from the university, they get 5,000 pesos per month, which is $10 per month. And for example, they could buy barely a piece of chicken every month, and they have kids, or, an egg. To find an egg is luxury. In the countryside, you can grow your chickens, you can, maybe grow something. But this guy also, with a problem with the legs, he was living 25 kilometers out of Havana, and he said, well, he had water maybe every 2 days and less electricity, for example.
People are desperate to get to the cities if they need urgent medical care, which is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you said that you were able to have some conversations with the locals. Just out of curiosity, before I actually field my next question, were you guys there when the blackouts happened?
Yes, a 24-hour island-wide blackout happened while we were there.
Yeah.
So
I mean, look, there's so many different ways to take this conversation. I think because a lot of what you're saying is, unfortunately, sometimes a reality in many other parts of the world as well.
Yeah.
Just desperate poverty like that. Regular blackouts. I mean, South Africa, you name it, parts of India, etc. But Cuba is unique in the sense of it had a revolution, and it has been under blockade for decades. And now that is, almost qualitatively worse, if you can even, call it that. I guess I want to talk about the contradictions of that a little bit. I think for the benefit of some of our listeners who may not come from the same sort of starting point as us, and they'll just say oh, well, Cuba's just a poor country because dictator and because corrupt and blah, 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 because I think it's important to lay a bit of a framework for how to understand that. This isn't just any country. This is a country that had a revolution. This is a country that has been a pain in the backside of the United States for decades.
Yeah.
And I think some of what you said, Anna, that it exemplifies what a deformed worker state is. But I think that makes sense to us, but I'm thinking, some of our younger audiences or some of our audiences who are like less familiar with that context, like how would we explain, for example, I think like even getting into some of the contradictions, like why does the black market exist? How is it able to exist? And you have these sort of like dual economies, the Cuban Revolution famously expropriated even like ice cream vendors, and now it's
Yeah.
at this stage where you have a pretty thriving like underground economy, which heavily disadvantages those people who aren't able to access American dollars, and has real like immediate life consequences for them in terms of accessing medical care or whatever. I guess like yeah, how would we explain like how Cuba finds itself in the current juncture? Maybe that's too broad of a question, but whoever is willing to take that big question up, I'm open.
Well,
Yeah.
I really did want to say that, at the time, the Cuban Revolution, which was successful in fighting off the blood-sucking imperialists, was an inspiration all over the world. I mean, and that's what I was saying about the Sandinistas, also black militants in the U.S. like Robert F. Williams and Asada Shakur, but also here in Mexico, it was an inspiration to the peasants and the guerrilla movements that happened in the 60s and 70s. And so I think that has something to do, too, with the generational, gap in the appreciation by Cubans of the revolution. So older people, including like the people we stayed with, are very, strongly in support of the revolution. And it's the younger generation who haven't really seen that or don't understand that as well, that have different opinions. And so it was very interesting. I thought the people we stayed with, the man had been, he had been in Africa, in Angola for 7 years, and he was there. He was the bodyguard to the president of Angola, but he was also there at the time when Cuba was helping to fight the South African-backed, apartheid people there, and we told him, he was a hero. But he also, at the same time, kind of said, "Well, none of the Communist Party of Cuba are communists, so I can't possibly be the first communist because I don't really know any." But his wife was very angry about the response to Venezuela. She felt like, all these Cubans were killed in Venezuela in January when Maduro was kidnapped. And she just thought something should have been done. And I think she probably felt like it was like her husband, who was there doing his internationalist duty. And she thought a lot more should have been done in terms of protests.
I think we've stated, and I think it's pretty well known, that about 1/5 of the Cuban population is left. Or large numbers of the Cuban population, especially young people, have left, and they're under the conditions of desperate poverty. But I mean, just to reiterate, Cuba was really a beacon of hope for hundreds of millions of people. And when the Cuban forces beat the South African forces in 1988, and ushered in the final fight against formal apartheid. That was like one of the last best things that happened in the entire world, where the forces of progress really beat back the forces of racist reaction. And but also, I mean, they had secured real sovereignty from the Yankee imperialism, which is a huge thing in Latin America, huge thing elsewhere. Real sovereignty, and were developing their economy as best they could with the assistance they could get. Albeit with real deformations. Now let's talk about right now, because a couple of Cubans we spoke to were suspicious, or at least had an ironic response to the gathering of people to help help over the last couple of weeks. When we brought down our stuff. So one taxi driver said to me, it would really be good if you would come down here and spend a year living like we live. then you'd understand how it really is. Because they thought that maybe there were just a lot of these liberals from the U.S. and elsewhere were just coming down with rose-colored glasses about the situation. The situation is really, really bad. And you can't blame the young people for feeling a certain desperation. There is access to the internet, to the outside world, and they can see, plain as day that they're living under horrific deprivation. Some of that also takes on,
For sure.
deep criticism of the regime for mismanagement of the economy, and also but feelings that even that the end of the Cuban Revolution would be a good thing for them. They'd like to get out. They think that it might bring immediate material benefits, which it actually might if the U.S. imperialists poured tons of money and stuff into it down there for a brief period of time. But it would also be a huge setback that would set the stage for turning Cuba into another Haiti, with no sovereignty whatsoever, smashing its education system, destroying its medical system overnight, whatever social protections that do exist. Yeah, no one knows what's going to happen, but everyone knows that something big is going to happen. And the blockade of petroleum is the tool, was the kind of like the dagger that they're now pushing into the body of the Cuban Revolution, which up until now hadn't been hadn't been the case.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit back because, like, everybody told us that a key kind of turning point was really the pandemic. The pandemic really destroyed tourism. And actually the first total blackout of the country happened then. And now I think the last one we were was either the 8th or the 9th. Total blackout of the country. So you could see, for example, that, and also during the pandemic, if I remember correctly, it was first made the first few small private shops, like maybe from people who had some family from outside and bringing also these shops, like it's not an official thing, but they give some money to the government or their bribes, so they can keep kind of, their shop. And also I think it happened, correct me if I'm wrong, I think also the 2 pesos, I think they stopped to have it back then, and then they just have the 1 peso and then start the dollarization, and stuff like that. So that actually enforced the black market. But that's
I'm not familiar enough with the 2 pesos and the 1 peso.
I think there were 2 pesos. One was kind of for tourists, let's say, it was equal to the dollar, kind of, and the other were for Cubans. So they stopped that, and they had 1 peso, which is really, I think it's $1 according to 500 pesos now, if I'm not mistaken. So this is kind of very hard for people because everything's much more expensive. So how understood it is that how the black market got developed. And I don't know how deep it is, but it looks to me that it's very deep. But the other point I think is really like, if you really invest on tourism in an island as a worker state, not like actually have a policy of industrialize, then it's very easy for the economy to go down. Of course, it's true that it's very difficult for the government, like in such a blockade, to do something. I mean, it's a huge. I'm not sure actually about Haiti because I don't know how it's in Haiti. I'm pretty sure it's horrible, but they have electricity. In Cuba, they don't. I mean, they don't have electricity. And also that affects the water, which we didn't know. Affects the water because every house in Cuba has underneath something like a cistern, and then you need electricity to, in English, I think, to pump it up, I think, to the house or something like that. So it also, like in the long run, affects also the water. So it's really very dire, the situation. Now, what the people also are afraid, a couple of them told us that they're really afraid, among other things, either the U.S. will invade, they don't know exactly what's happening, they don't know exactly what the government talks with the negotiations with the U.S., but they're also afraid about a civil war.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 2 people told us that, like from the many, like, because if poverty, like it's people don't have food, they don't have electricity, they live like, they don't have food for the children, this could, have some protest against the government. It doesn't mean, that they're anti-communists, it's the social conditions that determine what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's why, like, my impression is that really the situation and that the Cuban Revolution is really holding from a thread. It's very difficult situation. It's clear cannot continue forever. And I want to stress the point from the previous podcast you made with Comrade Julia, that a true revolutionary government, what we would do, and actually we couldn't, because we didn't have good internet, in Cuba, we couldn't hear the podcast, but we were talking among themselves, and we said, well, what we would do, and the thing is, I think you would really appeal to the Chinese proletariat, the mighty Chinese proletariat, to the American working class, to the Latin American working class, and to help Cuba, not just, with everything, and that actually would be for the benefit of the working classes against the ruling class or against the bureaucracy even in China. And that will help very much the struggle that it's needed against U.S. imperialism, really, to save Cuba, but also, to develop an anti-imperialist strong front against the main enemy of the world, which is the U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, nicely said. There's so much in what you said. I think, one of the things Julie and I briefly touched on was what the government is doing. I just looked up as of 13 hours ago. We're recording this on the 28th of March, but I'm just looking at the latest headlines. Reuters, Trump in a speech yesterday said Cuba is next. Like, these guys are not messing around.
Exactly. That's what we were thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just look at Iran, they were in talks and they got bombed. And negotiations with the US mean nothing. They mean nothing. So it's obvious that there's a generational difference, which I think is really, really interesting. And I think it's something you see in other countries as well right now, with Iran, for example, with Venezuela, the countries which the left will defend this revolution and that revolution, but then people are like, what are you talking about? It sucks here. We'll come to that in a bit. I guess I wanted to touch on how, in the segment of people you spoke to in Havana, how are people seeing, who are they mainly blaming? Is it really very much like an anti-US attitude? You guys have already in your own ways touched on the fact that there's, growing discontent against the government as well, but there's a bit of a generational character there. I wanted to get a sense of where's the anger mainly directed at? Maybe let's start with you, Tom.
Well, it's directed in a couple of different directions. I would say most people hate and despise Trump. Most people that we met. And you would contrast that with their actual deep illusions and the great Obama, who ushered in a period of relaxation and a period of relative economic ease with the tourist economy going well. They see that as, some called it a golden age or time under heaven or something. But they hate Trump. But in any conversation, especially with younger people, it will come up again, deep cynicism about the regimes using the blockade as an all-purpose excuse for their deprivation, for their condition. And they'll say, well, you've been saying that the blockade is the reason for all our problems for decades now, blah, blah, blah. So then you'll have to, but then there's also a recognition that now the blockade, the strangulation of all petroleum, really is in some ways worse now than it's been at any time, because with petroleum they can just asphyxiate the economy. So they're blaming. So no matter who you're talking to, the range of blame will go from the regime back to the U.S. imperialism. And then people will sometimes blame sections of their own population who are insufficiently defensive toward the Cuba, or people who just want to leave. Remember, that's a dynamic here that's playing out, all throughout society. And then there's people who do want to leave. They want to get out. So it runs the gamut.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask about was we haven't touched on the.
Can I add something? I'm sorry to interrupt you. To what Tom said. actually, some people, again, from the young people, we talked to a guy and his girlfriend, young Cuban, she said, actually, it would be all right if the Americans would come to help us, with whatever. And that's, I don't know how, these are tendencies in the population, we don't know how deep it goes. It's true that they hate Trump. They love Obama. But also, they're worried a little bit because lately they started some, during the blackouts, a section of the population started to make noise with pots. How you call it in Spanish? I don't remember. The cazarola something. And this is kind of, I think, the woman who talked to us about it, she was worried that really goes against the government, actually. So there is dissatisfaction among, because the conditions are horrible. So the dissatisfaction from different directions, like Tom said.
There's a lot of deep cynicism towards the government, which is very common in other worker states like China. Just deep cynicism that most of what the government says is untrue or lies or spin.
Yeah. So the U.S. is really trying to rot the country from inside, basically.
Yeah.
That's the danger.
Lisa, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, absolutely. People, hate Trump and they're very critical of the regime. But the other thing that, we were talking about China and what China should do, and people were pretty critical of China too. And not believing that it's possible to get, anything better from China. But the things that were kind of sacrosanct were both Obama and also Mexico. Because, of course, being from Mexico, there is a lot of criticism here about, how the Morena government cut off oil to Cuba. Calling for redoubling the oil to Cuba was very popular. And even La Jornada, which is a main newspaper in Mexico City, had editorials calling for, sending oil to Cuba again, which has not been done. But in Cuba itself, I could not find anyone who was critical of either Cuba as well as Obama. And I just wanted to say one other thing about Obama. Of course, he opened up the country. And so there was a great period for a while with the tourism, which set up for the horrible fall that's happening now. But also, he was responsible for sanctioning and attacking Venezuela, which had been, the main source of oil for Cuba. So Obama was responsible for that as well.
Okay. That's interesting to me, the illusions, especially in Mexico. I mean, Obama, I'm less familiar with that period and what that meant for Cuba, but Mexico, from the outside world, I did at the start of the year a podcast with Comrade Freddie from Mexico City, where we were talking about, the call to double the oil shipments. We thought Mexico is the second largest supplier of oil to the country. And, if Mexico kept supplying the oil, Cuba wouldn't be in the situation. So for me, it's a bit baffling that exists. I guess I want to step back. This was a particular moment where you guys went, the whole flotilla. We haven't talked about that. I'll come to that in a bit. But I guess I would like to turn the sort of angle a little bit and ask from the point of view of your respective countries, how is the question of Cuba received, for example, from the US right now, or Mexico or Greece? How are people actually relating to this question? Because obviously it's happening in a particular context where Trump is going after one country after another. So are people seeing that, okay, well, this is bad, that we should be taking a side here with Cuba? Or is this kind of not on top of people's minds? Or are they saying, oh, well, Cuba is just, another dictatorial government and we just need to get rid of it? I guess I want to talk about that a little bit in turn to get a bit of the texture. Tom, I'll come to you first from the United States. What's your sense?
Yeah, well, about a week before we went, there was a conference held in New York City that I attended in defense of Cuba and Cuban Revolution, and it had representatives of the Cuban government as well as leftists and progressives and Cuba Solidarity people there. But what was remarkable was how small it was. It was, I think, less than a couple hundred people. The person I was with remarked like 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, there would have been 1,000 people, or there would have been hundreds and hundreds of people. The people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis from the Caribbean and West Indies have a deep respect for Cuba. People in the United States, many working class people are sort of, in shock at the at the devastation and aggressiveness of the government, and they're keeping their heads down. I'm not. I think people feel for Cuba, but there's not a huge outpouring of sympathy right now that I'm seeing. On the left, certainly there's respect, and I think our efforts to raise money were fairly successful. But as you know, Trump's targets are all over the world now, and I think people are sort of, dumbfounded by how many targets they wake up to every morning, a new target. So that's the situation. But people do have deep respect for Cuba among the Caribbeans. Although it's fascinating, and it has been for decades in my discussions with them, they've also, people from Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and other islands, they fear being targeted by U.S. imperialism themselves. So like the Cuban road, or the Cuban guerrilla road, was not necessarily that popular. And I mean, it's impossible to create socialism on one island, and they felt it. Many of them felt like, well, I really respect Cuba. It's an incredible place, but we wouldn't want to invite that kind of hostility and from U.S. imperialism. They already know how bad U.S. imperialism can be. So, but today, right now, I'm not seeing a huge amount of sympathy for Cuba, unfortunately.
Yeah. And Lisa, what about you?
Well, I think there is like an enormous amount of sympathy for Cuba in Mexico. And even to the point, as I said, that La Jornada was critical of the government for stopping the oil shipments. But on the other hand, the demonstrations have been quite small, unfortunately. There was a fairly large one for Venezuela when that first happened in January. But then with the Cuba stuff, they've been quite small. People there are, calling to redouble the oil to Cuba is very popular with these people. And also, the thing about Mexico is pretty much a lot of people are collecting aid for Cuba all over the place. Unfortunately, it's been very dispersed. So there's like a million, not a million, but quite a few left groups, are collecting aid at the University UNAM. And then, we were collecting aid and all over the place, but it's not united, which is a big frustration. It's very dispersed and fairly small, unfortunately, even though it's obvious that people do sympathize, but they're not being mobilized.
Yeah. And Anna, what about Greece?
Well, Greece is kind of famous of defending Cuba. I think, because there is a mass communist party here. And, I think they have very close relations also with the Communist Party of Cuba. And they already sent a team, I think, like, I don't remember exactly, maybe a month ago or something. There were also some demos that were kind of big, a few of them. Also some left groups, I think everybody defends Cuba, but, and the left groups also try to get some aid and stuff like that. And there were meetings. But I think and also, there were demonstrations against the war. Actually, there is one now, has to do with Iran and all of that. But I think the problem is that although there is support, like generally the workers' movement, I think after the defeats they have suffered, it's kind of weak. So basically, even about the Iran war, I think you can see some big demos. On Venezuela, for example, there was one big demo, but then it was just not really just forgotten a little bit. Very few things happened. And then you have some bigger demos about the war in Iran, but also, I think combined kind of with Cuba, but mostly about Iran. But the problem is, I like the program behind this, like there's a lot of pacifism, about Iran war. Some of the groups, including KKE, don't take a clear stand for victory of Iran. And the whole point is about, disengagement from the country. Yes, we need to shut down the bases, but how are you going to do that? And calling also the government to shut down the bases, which is a lot of illusion, I think, towards that, like how this will happen. So basically, it doesn't exist a strong, although there is support, it doesn't exist a strong anti-imperialist movement here against the US and against the European Union too, I would say. So, and also, against that goes together against the Greek government, who gives a lot of help to the imperialists. So although there are demos, nothing kind of actually go forward, how to say, like, and also to connect Greece's situation, as an oppressed country, which many deny that is an oppressed country, including the Communist Party of Greece, with, the struggle against the war.
I just wanted to say one other thing about Mexico. I mean, there obviously is a lot of pressure by the population against the government on the cutoff of oil. And a couple of things that the government has done instead of oil is they sent, large shipments of powdered milk. And also they opened a bank account for Cuba, for people who want to send money to Cuba, that was announced by La Jornada. And Obrador made a big point of depositing money there. So and I kind of see it as like a workaround, or, like a making excuses for the not sending of the oil.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess this brings me to what is currently being done. Because you're right, even China, I think China sent like tons and tons of rice. Mexico sending food aid. And, these things count. But what would really actually help is giving Cuba the things that it needs to get its infrastructure back running, And more than that, on a political level, actually taking a stand against the United States instead of buckling under its pressure. So I kind of agree with your characterization, which is the workaround. So let's talk about what's actually being done. So you guys, your trip was there alongside the Nuestra America Flotilla. That was like, I don't know how large that was, at least hundreds of activists, leftists from internationally, including, celebrities like Love Kneecap, but you also had Jeremy Corbyn, who right here is on the right wing of your party and is like bureaucrat in chief of this like left operation. But on the international stage, he's out there waving flags in solidarity with the Cuban people. Then you also had, I think, Chris Smalls. Kind of, I don't know. Does anybody talk about Chris Smalls anymore? I don't know. I feel like he's a bit of a washed up trade union organizer, but whatever. But you had like, celebrities, you had famous journalists, you had, but also, rank and file activists of left organizations, as well as trade unionists like yourself, Tom. But I guess, what was it like being there with this group of people? Because obviously, you don't even have to think twice, but like there's a huge range of politics there. I think right now is like, it's a bit of like and this is what you see on social media. It's like, look, everybody's rallying to the aid of Cuba. All right. Yeah. Names and personalities are, but what's the actual political meat of this? So what was that like? Did you guys have interesting intersection or conversations with elements of this flotilla? And what was your experience like? Or how was that received? Anything on that front? I guess I'll start with you, Lisa. What was...
Well, it was interesting. It was very liberal. I think we'll all characterize it as that.
What does that mean, though? Like, what does that mean?
What does it mean?
Because, like, Cuba, like, what does that mean to be liberal right now in Cuba?
In Cuba.
Because, like, you can, not in Cuba, but on Cuba. Like, in a certain case, like, giving medicine, you could say is liberal, but we did that because that's a real material. So what does it mean to be liberal right now in this context, I guess?
Well, they really hate what the U.S. is doing, and they really support the government.
It was kind of so I can tell you that we were not really invited to the ceremonies. so we just had to wonder if we had been excluded because we're very forthright defenders of the Cuban Revolution. We're forthright revolutionary socialists who want to see the Cuba defended. But anyway, we weren't invited to some of the more swanky ceremonies where they got to meet government officials, and also we weren't staying at kind of the swanky hotels where we found out that some of them were staying and being toured around. So that was kind of interesting. But we did meet a lot of well-meaning leftists from around the world. The question of the hour was the very survival of the revolution and bringing aid. So, and I do know, and I'm sure your listeners will know, that Chris Smalls and several other participants were detained. I think Chris Smalls in Panama on the way back, and several dozen other participants were detained and had their personal electronics, their cell phones and laptops were taken from them when they returned in Miami. So there's still plenty of hostility from the U.S. government to these people for defending Cuba.
Yeah, and like I want to stress the point about like us excluded, because we try to figure out where this event 21st of March will happen, and we couldn't.
What event is this?
It was the event like to gather aid, like how it was called, the Nuestra America. Convoy. Yeah.
Flotilla.
So we tried to find out where it is, and we couldn't find. So we went, to ICAP, is the Institute of Cuban, how it's called, guys? Institute of Cuban People or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we went there, say hi, we are Partisan Defense Committee, and they said, oh, you're not registered, although we did register, from London and all of that. And then suddenly they changed 2 days ago the thing, and they said, oh, you cannot register as organizations, but only as people, so you cannot register anymore. So in a couple of the meetings, we couldn't go. What I thought it was also interesting, like talking. So basically, we saw this, the most of the convoy people in this concert, in this cultural event. What was striking for me is I think we were the only ones who had actually leaflets and newspapers, I think. I think the RCG had, but they had it in their bags. I don't know if they gave it away or something. But we had discussions about, Cuba and Spartacist and the Iran War and other stuff. But yeah. And I think people got disappointed from NICAP because they just sung 2 songs. So I think they were a bit disappointed from that. But yeah, there were like hundreds. Yeah, they were not, it didn't look, how to say, like, it looked like a cultural event where we go, not like a political event. That's how I would characterize it as liberal, although you would talk with people. And they were very happy to see us from the RCG and also from Berlin. But I think I found out later that the RCG, equally to the Communist Party of Greece, think that Cuba is socialist. And I think that's really gives a bad name to socialism, because socialism has nothing to do with poverty. And that's why we call it a deformed worker state, to show the contradictions, what we need to defend and what needs to be done to really defend it. Yeah.
I just wanted to say one other thing as a characterization of the liberalism. We found out that Code Pink, which is an anti-war group, I think based in New York City, chartered 2 planes that brought a lot of people down to Cuba, which is a really good thing. But yes, they are very, very liberal, kind of pacifist organization.
Yeah. A lot of pink hearts also. I haven't seen that before.
Yeah. I guess I want to start bringing this to a close. But look, for you guys were there on the ground. I think the discussion has been really helpful. And just, I think, seeing, for me, one of the most interesting points is about how there is, I guess, a sizable layer, especially amongst younger people, who don't see what there is to defend. Maybe that's overstating it. Do you think I'm overstating that?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to tell. These are the tendencies. How deep they go, I think it was also hard for us to see. But these tendencies does exist.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, and I think that's important for revolutionaries to take account of, and to be able to deal with that. Because, one of the things I was saying earlier, you see this with Iran today, you see this with Venezuela today, where the left will say, defend the Bolivarian Revolution, defend the 1979 revolution. But those governments, granted, they were not revolutions against private property, but that did, beat back imperialism decades ago. They have been incredibly repressive at home.
Yeah.
And people don't see what there is to defend. So there is a lot of cynicism and opposition. And unfortunately, that goes in the direction of, oh, yeah, well, maybe it's okay if Trump bombs Khamenei. Or maybe it's okay that Trump got rid of Maduro because now we can at least be, I don't know, now at least Delcy Rodriguez can get the oil companies pumping more oil and therefore the economy up and running. So for me, my reading of this in terms of seeing it from the point of view of the left, you either have like the totally liberal, like inoffensive cultural solidarity, like, spearheaded by the likes of Jeremy Corbyn or Owen Jones here in Britain. I don't know what other personalities you could name, but, it's kind of just empty words and doing nothing that draws any kind of real opposition to imperialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Granted, okay, well, by taking a trip to Cuba, you are maybe making the government a little bit annoyed, but, it's not actually going to do anything to concretely advance anything. And, what they do, they
You're
end up
absolutely
schmoozing. I
right.
saw on Instagram, there was like these, the president of Cuba hosted this huge rally with all of the flotilla activists, and they're all sitting in this like state assembly hall like dignitaries. It's like, come on, Well, I mean, not that that's a problem in and of itself, but what's the politics? And I think that brings you to the other side of the spectrum, which is you do get groups like the RCG, that's the Revolutionary Communist Group. We've actually done a lot of common defense work with that organization. One of their strong points is actually taking a really hard line against imperialism. But I think this is precisely where you see the problem as well, which is they, compared to us, where we're like, you got to take a stand against imperialism, but the Cuban government, its strategy is based on, let's negotiate with Trump and see what good deal we can come up with. It's not based on mobilizing the international proletariat. It's not based on building an anti-imperialist movement. So groups like the RCG, what they do is they say, oh no, Cuba is already socialist. Venezuela is socialist, and that actually makes a lot of people angry because they're like, what are you talking about? I don't want socialism if it looks like this. And that actually, it makes those segments of the left look like they're in cahoots with these bureaucracies, and those bureaucracies do need to be opposed. Yes, we take a stand with them, we'll defend them against imperialism, but their policies are not actually working. You cannot build socialism on a single island. Come on,
No.
Yes.
So... And I think that's kind of the problem right now. I know you characterize it quite strongly earlier. You said the Cuban Revolution is hanging on by a thread. And that may well be the case. I think that if that happens, that will be a tremendous defeat.
Disaster.
Yes.
It will be a huge disaster. You see what's happening in Latin America. It's slowly lurching more and more towards the right.
Yes.
You see, Trump is just bombing the hell out of Iran right now. Russia and China are sitting on their backsides. There is no such thing as BRICS. Come on. That was a joke. These multipolar anti-imperialist people. That was a complete joke. And what you see right now is like a complete vacuum, I think, in terms of like an actual movement against against U.S. imperialism. Where is that? And I think that's the complete gigantic abyss that revolutionaries need to start to fill. Show, okay, you need to oppose this, but that does not mean you politically support all these corrupt regimes. That includes the Cuban regime. That includes, the Maduro regime. That includes the Iranian government. That includes Scheinbaum. Like, there's a difference here. Yes, they're being attacked, and we'll defend them from that attack, but we do not politically share their outlook. And I think this is a lesson that the left refuses to learn again and again and again. And this is like, anyways.
That is absolutely true. And also this struggle, it needs to be connected with the struggle at every country. Like Greece, is so important. Like, why the people are not, in Iraq war, they were out in millions, I think, everywhere, right? I mean, okay, the politics then also were not good, I guess, but they were out in the millions. Now they're not. And the workers everywhere are in the back of their feet, so it's very important, like, you really need to connect the needs of the workers and all the oppressed at home and the small strata of the petty bourgeoisie against imperialists, because that's also the cause of their suffering in Greece, with to shut down the bases. But this, like to give a blow to the US imperialists and the EU and the Greek government. But that and a blow to the imperialists anywhere will be a benefit for the working class internationally. But to do that, you really need a strong anti-imperialist movement. And oppose your own bourgeoisie too. But like this doesn't actually exist. It can be big demos, it can be whatever, but without a strategy to give a blow, to the government and to the US and the EU, because many forget the EU, I think.
I just wanted to say about Mexico, I think there are a lot of people who think, well, Sheinbaum, gave some stuff to Trump and she's, she had to, there's nothing else that could be done. And the point that we're making is to not resist means more subordination. And that is so clear with the case of Cuba and Mexico. If Cuba falls, Mexico will be next. And I think, we're trying to make this point. And also the other thing we've been fighting for is like an anti-imperialist united front. Particularly throughout the Americas, obviously everywhere in the world.
For sure. But I think it's very concrete. I'm just going to reference back to the podcast I did earlier in January, or no, I don't know when that was, but with Freddie from Mexico City. It's very concrete because if you want to actually improve education, well, that needs money. Where is that money? It's tied up in imperialist investment. So you have to actually encroach against that. And I think in the United States, I just did my last episode was with Erica, and it was precisely on the question of what can stop Trump. And it's about making it concrete. Trump is waging war abroad, but here at home, there's ICE. There is currently the meat packers in Colorado. There's the nurses' strike that just happened. I mean, things at home are not looking good. So it is really the same struggle. And I think what the left also needs to do, and I appreciate you saying that it needs to link the struggles abroad to the struggles at home, because without doing that, then it just becomes a bit of a moralizing lecture, which really pisses off huge segments of the workers, because why am I going to give a shit about Cuba if nobody, what does the left have to offer me,
just solidarity.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's true. The Cuban Revolution it's gasping for air and desperately needs, help from abroad, and then in the form of real class struggle.
All right. Look, I've run out of questions. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add on this discussion? I think we urgently need to try and do this work. In the left to insist what anti-imperialism looks like in the case of Cuba, and to link that to the need to defend the revolution and actually extend it, That's the only way forward, or it's defeat.
It's really urgent. It's not going to last forever like this. It's really urgent to make this a force, against US imperialism, and also like a program that actually, like you said, defend and extend the revolution, because without extending it, you can defend it to a certain degree, but at some point, no. So
I think at this point, there's really no other choice. It's either going to go down.
Choice. Exactly. No, that's all I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. On that note, we do what we can to try and lay those lines.
Absolutely.
In the left, to try and build that movement, but short of that, your money helps. So keep donating. It absolutely helps.
And help also, and send, sorry to interrupt you, also medication to hospitals. That's really important too.
Absolutely. Okay. On that note, we will call it a day there.
Thank you, Mansa.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah,
thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, cheers. I will link the relevant information in the show notes. Please share this episode. with others who are following Cuba, who were on the ground in Cuba, or who are curious, because it's important, like, especially to the younger people, why this is actually such a big deal. It's crucial, and it's crucial to understand why we must defend it, but defend it with revolutionary methods, not the ones that, the liberal la-di-da. Anyways, okay, thanks, comrades. Goodbye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep, and your vote, it ain't gonna stop them.